A young woman went home on her lunch break, but never came back to the office. Her coworkers called the police, and they started an investigation. What detectives uncovered next felt more like the plot of a horror movie than a real case. And yet, piece by piece, they managed to uncover the truth. Carolyn Byington was born on May 30th, 1993, in Plainsboro, New Jersey. She lived there with her parents and older sister, and from a young age, she dreamed of seeing the world. After finishing high school, Carolyn went on to study at Lafayette College, where she took part in 2 study abroad programs, which gave her the chance to visit Japan and Germany. During college, she earned 3 bachelor's degrees in international affairs, sociology, and anthropology. After graduating in 2015, Carolyn got a job at a marketing company not far from her hometown, and she rented an apartment in Plainsboro to stay close to her family. Outside of work, she volunteered with a local youth league and stayed active in charity work. Over the next few years, Carolyn continued working at this company, giving back to her community and traveling whenever she had the chance. On June 10, 2019, 26-year-old Carolyn decided to go home during her lunch break. She was supposed to be back at the office later that afternoon, but as time went by, there was still no sign of her. Her coworkers started getting worried and tried calling, but Carolyn didn't pick up. The whole thing seemed really out of character. Carolyn was never one to miss work, and she almost never went home during lunch. She usually stayed in the office. By early evening, their concern had turned into serious worry, and they ended up calling the police to ask them to check if everything was okay. Around 6 p.m., officers arrived at Carolyn's apartment complex and found that her front door was unlocked. When they stepped inside, they were met with a horrifying scene. Carolyn was lying on the floor, and from the amount of blood around her, it was immediately clear she was dead. While the medical examiner began examining the body, investigators started looking for evidence and talking to potential witnesses. One neighbor told police he had heard screaming around noon. He also mentioned that afterward, there were strange noises coming from Carolyn's apartment, like someone was moving furniture around. But no one reported seeing any unfamiliar faces, and the complex didn't have any security cameras. Inside the apartment, police didn't find much to go on either. It looked like the killer had tried to clean the scene with bleach to cover their tracks. Most likely, the noises the neighbor heard were the killer doing exactly that. While investigators searched for security footage from nearby buildings and looked for any other possible leads, the medical examiner completed the autopsy. Carolyn had suffered multiple blows to the head, likely from fists. On top of that, she had been stabbed repeatedly in the neck with both scissors and a screwdriver. There were no signs of sexual assault, and nothing had been stolen from the apartment. But one detail stood out to detectives. The scissors and screwdriver had come from Carolyn's own apartment. All of that helped rule out the 2 most common motives, robbery and sexual assault, and pointed police towards something more personal. The sheer brutality of the attack also supported that theory. It looked like whoever had done this wasn't just trying to kill. They were full of rage. Police began interviewing Carolyn's family and friends, but no one could think of a single person who might have wanted to hurt her. They all described her as kind, easygoing, and completely non-confrontational. She wasn't in a relationship at the time, and she didn't have any problematic exes who might have held a grudge. Then detectives turned to her coworkers, and that's when things got interesting. They learned that on the same day Carolyn left the office for lunch, another employee did too, a 30-year-old man named Kenneth Saul. On its own, that didn't raise any red flags, but what caught their attention was the fact that Kenneth didn't come back to work until late in the day. Their manager told police that Kenneth had called to say he was having car trouble and needed to stop by a repair shop. But later, the manager checked and found out Kenneth had never actually gone to the place he mentioned. Other coworkers had noticed a few strange things too. When Kenneth returned to the office, he seemed nervous, and he had scratches on his hands. At one point during a casual conversation, he even asked if police could arrest someone based only on circumstantial evidence. Police were definitely intrigued by everything they heard and decided to take a closer look at Kenneth. He worked as an accountant, was married, and had recently become a father. His daughter had been born just a year earlier. He had no criminal record, and on the surface, he didn't seem like someone who fit the profile of a killer. Still, detectives couldn't ignore all the red flags and went to speak with him. Kenneth repeated the same story he told his boss, that he'd left work during lunch to get his car fixed at a repair shop. But when detectives asked him for a receipt or any kind of proof, he couldn't provide anything. Later, Kenneth changed his story. He claimed he hadn't gone to a repair shop at all. Instead, he said he'd fixed the car himself in a nearby park. That shift in his story didn't sit well with investigators. For one, the fact that he changed his account at all raised suspicions. And more importantly, Kenneth was an accountant, not exactly the type of person you'd expect to handle serious car repairs on his own instead of going to a mechanic. Still, Kenneth kept denying any involvement in the murder, and police didn't yet have enough evidence to arrest him. But sometime later, they came across something interesting. While reviewing surveillance footage from nearby buildings, they also pulled dashcam footage from a patrol car that had passed through the area shortly after noon. On the footage, they spotted Kenneth's car, and that completely contradicted his story. Carolyn's apartment complex was located in another town, about 6 miles from the office. Kenneth had claimed he was fixing his car in a park near work, but the footage clearly placed him near her home. Even though this was still considered circumstantial evidence, it strengthened the case against him. Another reason to suspect Kenneth came from the autopsy. Medical examiners had found traces of skin under Carolyn's fingernails, indicating she scratched her attacker during the struggle. And Kenneth just so happened to have fresh scratches on his hands, ones he couldn't explain. The only problem was that the biological material recovered wasn't enough to create a full DNA profile. Despite the setback, police collected a DNA sample from Kenneth and sent it to the lab. The results came back inconclusive. Experts couldn't definitively match the DNA found under Carolyn's fingerprints to him, but they couldn't rule him out either. It wasn't enough to prove anything, but it was enough to keep him in the spotlight. By this point, detectives were almost certain Kenneth was responsible. Over the next few weeks, they kept searching for more evidence, but nothing new came up. Eventually, they consulted with the district attorney, and together, they decided that all the circumstantial evidence might be enough to hold up in court. So, 2 months after Carolyn's murder, police arrested Kenneth and placed him in jail while he waited for trial. And that's when the case took an unexpected turn. As detectives continued building their case, they received a letter from the jail, from none other than Kenneth's cellmate. And what he had to say shocked everyone working on this case. According to the inmate, Kenneth had offered him $15,000 to commit a murder after he got out of jail, and the plan was chillingly specific. The victim had to be a random woman between 25 and 30 years old, and the weapon had to be a screwdriver and a pair of scissors. Kenneth even told him to stab her in the neck and to clean the scene with bleach afterward. Detectives had no doubt the cellmate was telling the truth, because at that point, the specific details of Carolyn's murder hadn't been released to the public. Only the killer could have known exactly what had been used to attack her, and how the crime scene had been cleaned. It seemed Kenneth's plan was to make it look like there was a serial killer targeting young women in the same way Carolyn had been murdered. And since he was already behind bars when the second attack would happen, he figured police would stop suspecting him. But that wasn't all. Kenneth also pitched a second plan to his cellmate, one that was even more bizarre than the first. He said the cellmate could either kill the lead detective on the case or one of the people police had interviewed during the investigation into Carolyn's murder. If he went with the second option, Kenneth told him to stage the scene to make it look like the person had done it themselves, and to leave a note on the body confessing to Carolyn's murder. The hope was that police would believe the murdered person had killed Carolyn and drop the charges against Kenneth, letting him walk free. As for the idea of killing the detective, it wasn't entirely clear what Kenneth expected to happen, but it seemed he thought that without the lead investigator, the whole case would just fall apart. On top of that, Kenneth even gave his cellmate tips on how to avoid getting caught after the murder, all while completely ignoring the fact that he himself had been arrested almost immediately. The whole plan was so far-fetched, it sounded like something a child would come up with. But Kenneth was dead serious. He truly believed this would get him out. After learning all this, detectives asked the inmate to wear a wire and bring it all up in conversation with Kenneth. He agreed, and it wasn't long before detectives had Kenneth on tape, casually talking about arranging multiple murders. That same day, prison staff searched Kenneth's cell and found several handwritten notes confessing to Carolyn's murder. The idea was to plant them next to the body of whoever his cellmate was supposed to kill, just like Kenneth had planned. He wrote the notes himself, thinking no one would even bother to compare the handwriting. With that, Kenneth had not only handed investigators even more evidence tying him to Carolyn's murder, but he'd also racked up additional charges for conspiracy to commit murder. And yet, even with all the disturbing things they'd uncovered, detectives still had no clue why Kenneth had killed Carolyn in the first place. Eventually, though, they got their answer, and it was something no one saw coming. Kenneth remained in jail for several years, and in November 2022, 3 years after his arrest, prosecutors decided to offer him a deal. Despite the mountain of circumstantial evidence, they still didn't have a definitive DNA match, fingerprints, or any rock-solid physical proof tying him to the scene, which made the upcoming trial a risky one. So, they decided to offer Kenneth a deal. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he would have to admit to the murder. And Kenneth agreed. He told investigators that he started working at the company back in 2016, 3 years before the murder. That's where he met Carolyn, and over time, he began to develop romantic feelings for her, despite the fact that he was married. But Carolyn wasn't interested, and she made that perfectly clear. Still, Kenneth wasn't willing to accept that. He kept those feelings to himself, at least on the surface. But beneath it all, he was slowly becoming obsessed. Kenneth never bothered her or made any overt moves. To most people, it looked like he had simply let it go. But behind the scenes, his obsession with Carolyn was growing stronger by the day. And that quiet fixation eventually spiraled into full-blown stalking. At some point, Kenneth secretly took Carolyn's house keys and made a copy, then slipped the original back without her ever noticing. From that moment on, he began letting himself into her apartment whenever she wasn't home, usually during his lunch breaks. But it didn't stop there. Eventually, he went even further and set up hidden cameras inside her apartment so he could watch her. And Carolyn had no idea. Over the next few months, Kenneth kept returning to her apartment to check on the hidden cameras. And on June 10th, he went back again during his lunch break. What he didn't realize was that Carolyn had also decided to head home that day. And because he'd left the office early, he had no idea. Kenneth was used to Carolyn spending her lunch breaks at work, so her unexpected return completely caught him off guard. According to his confession, he was inside the apartment when he suddenly heard a key turning in the lock. He quickly hid just out of view behind the front door, and when Carolyn walked in, he realized he had nowhere to run. Knowing she was about to see him, Kenneth attacked, slamming her to the floor and hitting her in the head several times. Then, he grabbed a pair of scissors and a screwdriver from her things and started stabbing her, mostly in the neck area. Once she was dead, Kenneth tried to clean up the scene with bleach, but there was just too much blood to get rid of. So he grabbed all the hidden cameras, fled the apartment, and later returned to the office like nothing had happened. In January 2023, Kenneth was sentenced to 45 years in prison for the murder, along with an additional 10 years for conspiracy to commit murder for his attempt to pay a fellow inmate to carry out more killings. Before the sentencing, Kenneth gave a final speech in court, apologizing to Carolyn's family. He said, "I'm sorry every day for my choices. If there was any way I could take back things that I've done, I would without any question. I regret immensely the pain I have caused you all. There are no words big enough to describe the atrocities I've done or the misery I've brought on you." He also apologized to his own family, who were present in the courtroom. "I'm sorry for the way I am and that I've hidden it from you for so long, my entire life. The facade I put up kept you from seeing any warning signs. I can only imagine the pain I've caused from the shock of learning the truth." Still, many people involved in the case questioned the sincerity of Kenneth's remorse. Not only had he brutally killed Carolyn just to avoid being exposed, but he was also willing to pay his cellmate to murder innocent people, all in a desperate attempt to escape responsibility for his own crime. As for Kenneth's wife, she had absolutely no idea what he'd been doing behind her back, and she filed for divorce shortly after his arrest. Despite his supposed remorse, Kenneth tried to appeal his sentence almost immediately after it was handed down. He argued that some of the evidence had been obtained in violation of his constitutional rights and should have been thrown out of the case. But in late 2024, the court rejected his appeal, finding no legal issues with how the investigation had been handled, so the original sentence was upheld. At this point, there's little doubt that Kenneth Saul will spend the rest of his life behind bars. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section. And don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.